He had been convicted through a carefully orchestrated act of betrayal. His wife Victoria's testimony, delivered with tears that somehow never quite reached her eyes, had painted him as volatile, controlling, dangerous. The prosecution had built their case on circumstantial evidence that fit together too perfectly, like someone had reverse-engineered the crime from the desired conclusion. James's prints on the knife because he'd cooked dinner the night before. Security footage placing him near the scene because his firm was renovating the building next door. Every piece of evidence made sense individually. Together, they formed a picture that wasn't quite right, like a blueprint drawn by someone who'd never actually built anything. Technically accurate, but fundamentally wrong about how real structures behaved under stress. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours. His lawyer, expensive but ineffective, had promised appeals. James had stopped listening halfway through the sentencing. He was already calculating different equations. Asset distribution, power of attorney. The realization, cold and certain as structural steel, that Victoria had planned this with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd once admired in her approach to interior design. She'd redecorated their entire life, and he was the piece that no longer fit the aesthetic. The architect in James Carter noticed the flaw in Blackwood State Correctional before he'd even crossed the threshold. The way the intake building's foundations settled unevenly, how the security camera angles left blind spots at corridor intersections, the ventilation system's outdated design creating pressure differentials that any competent engineer would have flagged years ago. These observations were automatic. 23 years of designing structures from hospitals to high-rises had trained his eye to see what others missed. Systems, weaknesses, the skeleton beneath the skin. He didn't know yet that this particular skill set would save his life. Blackwood State Correctional sat 40 miles outside Pittsburgh, a medium security facility that housed 1,200 men in conditions that violated every building code James had ever studied. The cell block architecture was brutalist 1970s institutional. Concrete and steel designed more for psychological oppression than actual security. Efficient cruelty rather than thoughtful containment. His cellmate was already there when the guard shoved James through the door. The man sat on the lower bunk, back against the wall, watching James with the kind of assessment that came from experience rather than hostility. Early 30s, Latino, built like someone who'd spent significant time in the yard. Prison tattoos crawled up both arms, not the prison-quality ink of desperation, but professional work done before incarceration. Carlos Rivera, the man said, not offering his hand. Handshakes meant something different here. You're the architect. James set his thin mattress on the upper bunk. The cell was 8 by 10 feet, 160 square feet to contain 2 adult men, their possessions, their waste, their private thoughts, and the constant proximity that would either forge alliance or ignite violence. Poor space efficiency, no natural light, acoustically terrible. James Carter, he replied. You killed your business partner over a money dispute. Carlos shrugged. Nobody much cares if it's true. Just matters what you're charged with. It's not true. Yeah. Carlos's expression suggested he'd heard that before. It never is. The first week James spent learning the architecture of survival. Blackwood operated on systems within systems, the official structure of guards and regulations, and beneath it, the real infrastructure of gangs, debts, and territories invisible to anyone who didn't know how to read the signs. It was like studying load-bearing walls in a building. The visible elements told one story. The actual stress points told another. Carlos proved to be an unexpected asset. The younger man had street intelligence that complemented James's systematic thinking. He explained the hierarchy without James having to ask, pointing out power dynamics the way James might have identified structural supports. "See that guy?" Carlos nodded toward a massive black man holding court near the phones. "Tyrell Jackson. They call him Reaper. Runs with the disciples. He's connected outside. His wife moves product, handles money, makes him valuable in here. Also makes him dangerous. You don't look at him. You definitely don't talk to him." James filed the information away, another data point in the prison's complex system. He had no intention of interacting with gang politics. He was there by mistake, a temporary situation until appeals corrected the error. He just needed to stay invisible until the system processed his inevitable release. That belief lasted exactly 9 days. The assault happened in the shower. James had learned the safest time was early morning, before the yard opened, when most inmates were still in their cells. He'd developed a routine: 5 minutes, efficient, done. Architecture applied to personal safety. He was rinsing shampoo when his peripheral vision caught movement. Too fast. Too purposeful. Tyrell Jackson materialized from the steam, a shank fashioned from a sharpened toothbrush handle gripped in his right fist. His face carried no emotion, just focused intention. This wasn't rage. It was a job. James's mind accelerated into the kind of hyperclarity he'd experienced during the verdict. Time didn't slow. That was a myth. But his perception sharpened, processing variables with the same systematic analysis he'd applied to structural engineering. Distance, 8 feet. Closing speed, 3 seconds. Weapon, 4-inch improvised blade, probably meant for chest or neck. Escape routes, blocked by Jackson's positioning. Defensive options, limited, wet tile, no traction. The equation didn't favor survival. Then Carlos was there, hitting Jackson from the side with the full force of his muscular frame. They went down hard, sliding across wet tile in a tangle of limbs and violence. Carlos moved with street-fighting efficiency. No wasted motion. Every strike calculated for maximum damage. He caught Jackson's wrist, slammed it twice against the concrete bench, and the shank clattered away. "Run!" Carlos shouted, driving his elbow into Jackson's face with a sickening crack. James didn't run. He grabbed a towel, wrapped it around his waist, and helped Carlos pin Jackson long enough for the guards, finally responding to the commotion, to separate them. In the aftermath, sitting in the medical unit while a disinterested nurse checked Carlos for injuries, the reality crystallized with the same cold precision James had felt during his sentencing. "Why?" James asked quietly. Carlos wiped blood from his split knuckle, his expression unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to get set up. And because Reaper doesn't move on somebody without money. Somebody paid for that hit." "Who?" "Only one person who'd want you dead bad enough to spend money on it." Carlos met his eyes. "Your wife?" The words landed like a structural failure. Sudden, catastrophic, but somehow inevitable in retrospect. Of course Victoria wanted him dead. A widow could access everything. A divorce would mean lawyers, questions, time. A dead husband was clean. Final. James sat back, his mind already working through the implications. Victoria had framed him for murder, testified against him, and now wanted him killed in prison. The perfect crime, really. Murder disguised as prison violence. No investigation. No questions. He thought about the appeals his lawyer was supposedly filing, the evidence review that might take years, the system that had already failed him once and had no reason to work better the second time. "I need to ask you something," James said carefully. "And I need you to answer honestly. Can I prove it was her?" Carlos shook his head. "Reaper's wife handles everything outside. No paper trail, no phone records, cash transaction probably. And nobody in here's gonna testify about gang business. You can't prove shit. James nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much, but confirmation closed certain avenues, opened others. If he couldn't prove Victoria's involvement, he couldn't use the system to save himself, which meant he needed a different strategy. How long before Reaper tries again? He got paid. He'll keep trying until you're dead, or he gets stopped permanent. Carlos's tone was matter-of-fact. That's how it works. Contract's a contract. Then I need to leave. Carlos stared at him. Leave? You mean escape? Man, you're in a medium-security state prison. Cameras everywhere. Guards, fences, electronic locks. You don't just walk out. No, James agreed. You don't walk out. You need a plan. A comprehensive strategy that accounts for every variable. He looked at Carlos. You saved my life. I'm not asking you to risk yours. But if you're interested in getting out of here, actually getting out, I think I can find a way. You're serious. Completely. I've spent 23 years studying how buildings work, how systems function, where the weak points hide. James's voice carried the quiet confidence of absolute certainty. Every structure has flaws. You just need to know how to see them. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his street-smart mind clearly weighing risks against possibilities. What would you need? Time. Access to maintenance areas, your physical capability, and your knowledge of how this place really works. And patience. It won't be fast. How long? 3 to 4 weeks. Maybe less if opportunities present themselves. But this needs to be perfect. No improvisation. Every detail planned. Every contingency anticipated. James met the younger man's eyes. I design things that don't fail, Carlos. We get one chance. I need to make sure we get it right. Carlos extended his hand, not the cautious acknowledgement of their first meeting, but a genuine offer of partnership. Then let's build something together, architect. Let's build a way out. James shook it, feeling something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope was emotional, unreliable. This was different. This was calculation, strategy, the cold, precise application of expertise to a problem that could be solved. He'd spent his career designing structures that would stand against stress, weather, time, and human error. Now he would design something else, a systematic dismantling of the prison's architecture piece by piece, until he'd created a path to freedom. Victoria thought she'd buried him alive. She'd made a critical error. She'd trapped an architect in a flawed building and given him every motivation to find the exit. The next morning, James reported to his assigned work detail, maintenance crew. The supervisor, a corrections officer named Brennan who looked perpetually hungover and maximally uninterested in his job, barely glanced up from his clipboard. You're Carter? The architect? Yes. Good. Maybe you can figure out why C Block keeps flooding. Plumbing's been screwed for months. Take Rivera with you. He knows where the tools are. James and Carlos exchanged a glance. The timing was almost too perfect. The kind of coincidence that suggested the universe occasionally provided opportunities to those ready to seize them. They descended into Blackwood's maintenance level, a warren of concrete corridors beneath the main facility that housed the prison's critical infrastructure. Pipes, electrical conduits, HVAC systems, and the ancient, poorly maintained network that kept 1,200 inmates supplied with water, heat, and waste removal. To most people, it would have looked like industrial chaos. To James, it was a blueprint waiting to be read. He moved through the space methodically, his trained eye cataloging details that maintenance crews had missed or ignored. The way certain pipe joints showed stress fractures, how the drainage system's slope was off by nearly 3 degrees. Not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to create long-term problems. The outdated sewage line that ran beneath C Block, installed decades ago according to codes that no longer existed. And there, near the eastern corner of the maintenance level, he found it. A cast-iron access panel, 24 inches in diameter, secured by 6 bolts that showed significant rust corrosion. According to the faded stenciling, it connected to the main sewage trunk line, the primary waste conduit that ran from the facility to the municipal treatment system a quarter-mile away. James knelt beside it, running his fingers over the bolts. 3 were already loose, degraded by moisture and time. The panel itself sat in a depression that had collected standing water, creating the perfect environment for structural breakdown. "What are you looking at?" Carlos asked, kneeling beside him. James didn't answer immediately. His mind was already constructing the full picture, the sewage trunk's dimensions based on the facility's occupancy, the likely route it would take to reach the treatment system, the access points that would be required for maintenance. The trunk would be large enough for a man to move through. Uncomfortable, disgusting, but physically possible. And if this access panel was corroded, others along the line might be as well. "I'm looking at a critical structural weakness," James said quietly, "one that's about to become our exit." Over the following days, James mapped Blackwood's maintenance infrastructure with the same meticulous attention he'd once applied to architectural surveys. He documented shift changes, guard patterns, camera positions, and the facility's daily rhythms. Every prison operated on schedules, meals, counts, yard time, lights out. Understanding the architecture of time was as crucial as understanding the physical structure. Carlos provided intelligence James couldn't have gathered alone. Which guards could be distracted? Which inmates could be trusted with small favors in exchange for commissary credit? The informal economy that operated beneath official regulation. Together, they formed a team that combined systematic precision with street-level execution. James designed, Carlos facilitated. "We need to loosen the remaining bolts gradually," James explained one evening in their cell, speaking low enough that their conversation disappeared into the ambient noise. "Too fast, and maintenance might notice during routine inspections. We have maybe 3 weeks before Reaper makes another move." "He's watching," Carlos confirmed. "Got his crew keeping tabs. They're waiting for the right opportunity. Isolated location. No witnesses. Then we don't give them that opportunity. We stay visible. We stick together." James paused. "And we use the time to prepare everything else." "Everything else?" "The panel is just the beginning. We need tools, civilian clothes, money, a way to bypass the treatment facility's security. Transportation once we're outside." James's tone remained calm, methodical, breaking the enormous challenge into manageable components. "Every successful project requires proper planning. This is no different." Carlos nodded slowly. "You really think we can do this?" It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. "I know we can. Because I've calculated every variable, identified every risk, and designed solutions for each contingency. I don't leave things to chance, Carlos. I never have." What James didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was the other calculation running through his mind. The one that had nothing to do with architectural precision and everything to do with the cold fury that had replaced the shock of betrayal. Victoria had taken his freedom, his reputation, his life's work. She'd sent someone to kill him, believing he was helpless, trapped, already as good as dead. She'd underestimated the fundamental truth of his profession. Architects didn't just build structures. They understood how forces interacted, how to manipulate systems, how to transform abstract concepts into physical reality. He would escape this prison. He would expose her crimes. And he would make sure Victoria understood exactly what it felt like to watch everything you'd built collapse around you, piece by calculated piece. But first, he had to work. Every day, James and Carlos returned to the maintenance level. They addressed the C-block flooding issue, a legitimate problem that gave them cover for spending hours in the infrastructure space. They replaced corroded pipes, cleared drains, and slowly, methodically, loosened the bolts on the sewage access panel. James worked with the patience of someone who understood that structural failures happened not in dramatic collapses, but through accumulated stress over time. Each day, he'd loosen the bolts by fractions of a turn, enough to make progress, not enough to be noticed. He also studied the sewage trunk's route, cross-referencing faded maintenance diagrams he'd discovered in a forgotten filing cabinet with his own observations of the facility's layout. The trunk ran east from the prison, following the natural drainage slope, before connecting to the municipal system near the access road that serviced both Blackwood and the adjacent industrial park. There would be a maintenance access point there, possibly monitored, probably locked, but accessible from inside the trunk if you knew where to look and how to bypass basic security. Everything depended on precision, timing, execution, and trust. "Why are you helping me?" James asked one night, lying on his bunk while Carlos sat below, reading a worn paperback. Carlos was quiet for a moment. "Told you. I know what it's like to get set up." "That's not the whole reason." "No." Carlos closed the book. "When I was 22, I had a girlfriend. Rosa. We were going to get married, have kids, the whole thing. Then her ex came around, started making threats. Said if she didn't come back to him, he'd hurt her family." James waited. "I went to talk to him. I just wanted to talk. But he came at me with a pipe, so I defended myself. He went down, hit his head on concrete. Died 3 days later." Carlos's voice was flat, recounting facts. "Rosa testified I'd attacked him. Said I'd always been violent, jealous. Her family backed her up. Turns out she'd never left him." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, well, I got 7 years for manslaughter. Rosa got his insurance money." Carlos looked up at the underside of James's bunk. "So, when I see someone else getting destroyed by somebody they trusted, somebody who's supposed to have their back, I know exactly what that feels like, and I figure maybe this time I can help change how it ends." James understood then that this was about more than escape. It was about two men who'd been systematically betrayed by people they'd loved, fighting back against a system designed to crush them. Different circumstances. Same fundamental injustice. "When we get out," James said quietly, "I'm going to destroy her. Legally, financially, publicly. I'm going to take everything she stole and make sure everyone knows what she did." "Good," Carlos replied. "She deserves it. They all do." The days blurred together in a rhythm of work, observation, and meticulous preparation. 3 weeks became 2. Then 10 days. James could feel time compressing, Reaper's presence a constant pressure, waiting for the right moment to complete the contract Victoria had purchased. But James was faster, more precise, more patient. The sewage access panel came free with barely a sound, decades of corrosion having done most of the work. James set it aside carefully, revealing the darkness below, a circular opening that descended into Blackwood's underbelly. The smell hit immediately, but he'd anticipated that. Everything about this escape required accepting discomfort in service of freedom, because it was a doorway to freedom. The stench seeping from the narrow tunnels, rising out of the darkness, meant nothing to them compared to what waited on the other side. Freedom. "Tonight," James said quietly, replacing the panel. "After midnight count. We have a 6-hour window before morning head count." Carlos nodded, his expression tense but focused. 26 days of preparation had led to this moment. Every variable accounted for. Every contingency planned. Tools hidden in maintenance closets. Civilian clothes stolen piece by piece from the laundry and stashed in air vents. A detailed map of the sewage trunk's route, committed to memory. The day crawled forward with agonizing slowness. James moved through his routine with mechanical precision, his mind constantly running calculations. Guard shift changes happened at 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. Midnight count took approximately 20 minutes. Cell lights went out at 10:30. They'd have from 12:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. 5.5 hours to navigate a quarter-mile of sewage tunnel, bypass the treatment facility's perimeter, and reach the access road where Carlos's cousin would be waiting with transportation. Carlos had managed to get a message out through another inmate's girlfriend, arranging the pickup without phone records or traceable communication. At dinner, James noticed Reaper watching from across the cafeteria. The man's patience was running thin. 26 days since the failed shower attack, and his contract remained unfulfilled. James had made himself difficult to isolate, always with Carlos, always in supervised areas, but that caution couldn't last forever. Reaper didn't know he was about to lose his target entirely. Back in their cell, as dusk settled into full dark, James and Carlos reviewed the plan one final time. They spoke in code, their conversation sounding like meaningless chatter to anyone monitoring, but every word carried precise meaning. "You remember the route?" James asked. "East trunk, 200 yards to the junction, then south another 300 to the maintenance access. Bypass the lock with the tools. Exit near the industrial park access road." Carlos's voice was steady. 30 minutes if we move fast. 45 if there's complications." "There won't be complications." "I've accounted for everything." James met his eyes. "Once we're in that tunnel, we don't stop. Don't second-guess. Don't hesitate. We execute exactly as planned." "And after?" "After, we disappear. I have resources Victoria doesn't know about. Accounts she couldn't access. We get clean, get safe, and then I start dismantling everything she built on my destruction." The promise in James's voice carried the cold precision of architectural calculation. Victoria had constructed her new life on a foundation of lies, theft, and attempted murder. James would identify every load-bearing element of that structure and systematically remove them until the whole thing collapsed. Lights out came at 10:30. The cell block settled into the familiar sounds of confinement: coughing, snoring, the occasional shout from someone lost in nightmares or breaking from the pressure. James lay still on his bunk, tracking time by the rhythm of guard rounds. 23 years of maintaining project timelines had given him an internal clock that rarely erred by more than a few minutes. At 11:47 p.m., footsteps approached. Night shift guards conducting their initial sweep. James breathed evenly, feigning sleep, while his mind remained hyper-alert. The guards' flashlight swept across their cell, lingered for 3 seconds, then moved on. Midnight count began at exactly 12:03 a.m. Automated voice announcing the count over the intercom. Guards moving through cell blocks, verifying bodies in bunks. The process took 18 minutes. James had timed it repeatedly. By 12:25 a.m., the guards had returned to their station, and the facility settled into the minimal supervision of night watch. At 12:32 a.m., James climbed down from his bunk. Carlos was already up, dressed in the dark clothes they'd assembled. James changed quickly, pulling on civilian jeans and a navy work shirt that would help them blend in outside the prison. They'd planned every detail down to avoiding bright colors that might catch attention. The cell door presented their first serious obstacle. Blackwood's locks were electronic, controlled from the guard station. But James had studied the system during his maintenance work and identified a critical flaw. The backup manual override, installed decades ago and never updated, could be accessed from inside cells if you knew where to look and had the right tools. He knelt beside the doorframe, using a thin piece of metal Carlos had fashioned from a bed frame spring. The override mechanism was primitive, a simple lever system behind a panel that maintenance crews used when electronic locks failed. James had loosened the panel screws over the past week. Now it came free silently. He inserted the metal strip, found the lever, and applied precise pressure. The lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the quiet. They froze, waiting. No alarms, no footsteps. The guard station was 50 yards away, around a corner, the guards likely distracted by paperwork or phones. James opened the door 6 inches and checked the corridor. Empty. Camera positions he'd memorized showed 2 blind spots, one near the bathroom entrance, another at the maintenance level access. They'd use both. They moved like shadows, Carlos leading with street-learned stealth, James following with the quiet confidence of someone who'd planned every step. The bathroom blind spot gave them 30 seconds of cover. The maintenance access required a key card, but James had discovered that maintenance supervisor Brennan frequently left his card in his desk overnight, trusting the locked office more than he should have. Breaking into the office took 90 seconds. Carlos kept watch while James used another improvised tool to manipulate the simple lock. Brennan's keycard sat exactly where James had observed it a week ago, nestled beneath a stack of requisition forms. The maintenance-level access beeped softly as James swiped the card. The door opened, and they descended into the concrete warren beneath the prison. Emergency lighting cast everything in dim amber, creating long shadows that moved with them. James navigated by memory, leading them through the maze of pipes and conduits to the eastern corner where the sewage access waited. Every sound seemed amplified. Their breathing, footsteps, the distant gurgle of water through pipes. But no alarms followed. No shouts of discovery. The prison above them continued its slow rotation through the night, unaware that 2 inmates were already gone. The access panel lifted easily, revealing the darkness below. James pulled out a small LED flashlight they'd stolen from maintenance, a calculated risk, but necessary. The beam revealed a ladder descending 10 feet to the main sewage trunk. The smell was overwhelming, a physical presence that made breathing difficult. But James had prepared for this too, mentally conditioning himself by working near the facility's waste processing during maintenance shifts. Discomfort was temporary. Freedom was permanent. "Ready?" he asked Carlos. The younger man nodded, his jaw tight but his eyes determined. James descended first, his feet finding the ladder rungs slick with moisture and substances he didn't examine closely. The trunk itself was larger than he'd estimated, nearly 4 feet in diameter, allowing them to move in a crouch rather than crawling. The concrete walls showed decades of buildup, and 6 inches of liquid moved slowly eastward, following the drainage gradient James had calculated. Carlos followed, pulling the access panel partially closed above them. Not fully, that would attract attention, but enough to obscure the opening from casual observation. By the time guards discovered the escape during morning count, they'd be miles away. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, the flashlight beam revealing only 30 feet at a time. James moved forward methodically, testing footing, avoiding the deeper channels where waste accumulated. Every 20 yards, he paused to check their progress against his mental map. The trunk ran straight for the first 200 yards, then angled south at the junction where it connected to the city's larger sewage network. Time became fluid in the darkness. James tracked their progress by counting steps, by the changing acoustics that indicated wider chambers or narrowing passages. His architectural training had taught him to understand spaces, even when he couldn't see them, to feel how sound moved, how air pressure shifted, how structures revealed themselves through subtle cues. Behind him, Carlos moved with surprising grace for someone navigating a sewer in near-total darkness. The street-smart fighter had become invaluable, his loyalty absolute, his execution flawless. They'd become a unit, mind and muscle, precision and power. The junction appeared exactly where James had calculated, marked by a widening of the tunnel and the intersection of 3 different pipes. The south trunk was their route, identifiable by the slight downward slope and the increased water flow. James led them into it without hesitation. Another 300 yards. The maintenance access would be ahead, marked by a vertical shaft leading to surface level. James had studied the city's sewage infrastructure records during his maintenance work, cross-referencing old blueprints with current maps. The access shaft would have a locked hatch, but the lock was external, designed to keep people out, not in. They could bypass it from below. 20 minutes into the tunnel, Carlos spoke for the first time since entering. "You hear that?" James stopped, listening. At first, nothing. Then, distant but distinct, the sound of flowing water increasing in volume. His mind processed the implications immediately. Increased flow meant either heavy rain upstream or scheduled flushing from the treatment facility. Either scenario presented problems. Heavy flow could make movement dangerous, potentially sweeping them into deeper channels or overwhelming them with waste volume. "We need to move faster," James said, his calm tone belying the urgency of the situation. "The flow's increasing. We have maybe 10 minutes before this becomes hazardous." They accelerated, moving as quickly as the cramped space and treacherous footing allowed. The water level rose from 6 inches to 8, then 10. The sound grew louder, a rumbling that suggested significant volume approaching from ahead. James's flashlight caught the vertical shaft opening, a concrete cylinder rising 20 feet to surface level, with metal rungs embedded in the wall. The maintenance access. Their exit. "Up!" James pushed Carlos toward the ladder. "Fast!" Carlos didn't question, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the first rung and started climbing with the athletic efficiency James had counted on. Below, the water continued rising, now at 12 inches and climbing faster. The scheduled flush. It had to be. Treatment facilities often ran automated cleaning cycles at night when usage was lowest. James followed Carlos up the ladder, his hands finding rungs slick with algae and moisture. Above, he could hear Carlos working on the hatch, the sound of metal scraping metal, the grunt of effort as the younger man applied his considerable strength to the corroded lock mechanism. The water below was at 18 inches now, the flow violent enough that falling would mean being swept away into the city's sewage system with no easy exit point. James climbed faster, his architect's mind already calculating how long the flush cycle would last, how high the water would rise, whether the shaft would flood completely. With a metallic screech, the hatch gave way. Carlos shoved it open, and cold night air flooded down the shaft, carrying the scent of freedom. He pulled himself through, then reached back down for James. James grabbed his hand and let Carlos haul him up the final few feet, emerging onto wet grass beside a chain-link fence that separated the treatment facility from the access road beyond. They were outside, free. The prison was a quarter-mile behind them, its lights visible through the industrial park's sparse trees, but its walls no longer containing them. They pulled the hatch closed, concealing evidence of their route. Carlos had bolt cutters hidden in his clothes, stolen weeks ago and carried through the tunnel despite the risk. He made short work of the fence, creating an opening large enough to slip through. A pair of headlights flashed twice from the access road. Carlos's cousin, exactly on time, exactly where planned. They ran across 50 yards of open ground, every second expecting searchlights or sirens, but none came. The prison's systems hadn't detected their absence yet. Morning count was still 5 hours away. By then, they'd be in another state, identities switched, trail cold. The car was a nondescript sedan, unremarkable and unmemorable. Carlos's cousin, a lean man in his 40s who asked no questions, simply nodded as they climbed into the back seat. "Where to?" he asked in Spanish. "North," Carlos replied. "I'll tell you when to stop." As they pulled away, James looked back at Blackwood State Correctional one final time. 26 days of meticulous planning. Countless hours of observation, calculation, and preparation. And now, impossibly, they were free. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. James pulled out a burner phone they'd arranged to have waiting in the car. He had calls to make, resources to access. A lawyer who specialized in wrongful convictions and had enough integrity to listen before judging. And he had Victoria to destroy. She thought she'd buried him, thought the prison walls would hold him until Reaper's shank found its mark. She'd underestimated the fundamental truth James had learned building structures for 2 decades. Every system has weaknesses. You just need the intelligence to find them and the patience to exploit them properly. "What now?" Carlos asked, watching the prison lights disappear behind them. James's expression was calm, controlled, but his eyes carried something colder than any concrete cell. "Now we build a new structure. One where Victoria loses everything she stole. Her money, her freedom, her future. Revenge? Justice," James corrected. "Precise, calculated, and absolutely inevitable. She designed my prison. Now I'll design hers." The car carried them north into the night. 2 men who'd escaped not just a building, but a system designed to break them. They'd proven that intelligence and loyalty could overcome walls, bars, and corrupt intent. And Victoria Carter, sleeping peacefully in the home she'd bought with stolen money, had no idea that the man she'd tried to bury alive was coming for her with the methodical patience of an architect who never left structural flaws unaddressed. The real construction was about to begin.